welcome to the Titans of Industry show. Today, if nothing else, my goal is to open your mind to the subject that is so close to all of us that we rarely think about it thoroughly. But as a business person, as an entrepreneur, I've spent considerable time strategizing and planning tax advantages for my own entities and enterprises. And during my search, and also through referral from enlightened subscribers of wealthresearchgroup.com, we learn about the most schooled tax expert in the world on the United States of America's history of the IRS and their income tax and taxes overall. And he's not even a CPA. That's the brilliant thing about this. And I am very excited to have on the show Mr. Dave Champion. Dave, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm great, Lior. Thank you very much for the invitation. A pleasure to be here.
Well, first and foremost, are taxes in the U.S., the way that they're set up right now, are they, in your mind, after studying this for, you can tell us how many years, are they a giant crime and a sin to the original Constitution? In other words, there are many laws written by countries, I've been to 42 countries in my life by now, and I've seen many countries where the books say one thing, but they're not enforced, or they're interpreted in like a street interpretation, and basically there's a big discrepancy between the books and what's going on in practice. Is this one such case?
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It's not so much that the law here isn't enforced, it's just nobody knows what the law actually says. The way I characterize it often is there's a difference between what's going on in the law books and what's going on the street. Completely separate dynamics. And, in America, we have unalienable rights. I think most everybody listening understands that concept, that America was founded on unalienable rights. And those rights cannot be altered by the government. So let's fast forward from that to 1913 and the income tax. The 16th Amendment was ratified, and then, of course, the tax code was created subsequent to that. And Americans just go along because someone told them to. That's always the way it is. Nobody actually reads the law. Well, I had a run-in. It absolutely is. I have literally, consistently, this isn't a one-off, consistently talked to CPAs, accountants, HR people, attorneys, and tax attorneys, and they say it's the law. I say, okay, great. Where is that law? Silence. They have no idea. And then we sit down and talk about the law, and I show them the law. They say, well, that can't be right. What do you mean this can't be right? This is supposed to be your area of expertise. Why are you telling me you've never seen this before, and this causes you a problem, and something can't be right?
So where is this? I'm sorry to interrupt, but where is this law actually written? Is it one law that you're referring to right now, or is this obviously a lengthy book including many different laws from over the years? What is this law that you present to these CPAs that get them so dazzled up?
Well, formally, if somebody wants to look at tax law, it's Title 26 of the United States Code. But then we get into what parts of that control the issues that most people are dealing with in their lives. And predominantly, you've got subtitle A, which is entitled the income tax, and in there you've got chapters 1 and 2, which are what I call the rules of computation. You've got chapter 3, which describes who the tax is actually really imposed upon, and then you've got subtitle C, which is employment taxes, W-4s, withholding, and things like that. So those are the elements of the law that people should be looking at and are not. And everybody just goes along because it's always been done this way. I don't know how you feel, Lior, but my thing is whenever somebody says to me, it's always been this way, and they use that as some sort of defense, I realize I'm talking to an idiot, because how it has always been done does not necessarily justify how it should be done, or what the better way we'd like to do it tomorrow. But in this case, how it's always been done isn't even compliant with the law, which is the baffling part. Every time I sit down and talk to somebody who just wants to do it the way it's always been done. Well, look, when you come to work for me, you have to sign a W-4. Really? Where does it say that in the law? Pardon me? Well, you just said I have to sign a W-4 in order to work for you. Where does it say that in the law? I don't understand what you're asking. Can you show? You're asking me to sign a form under a federal form under penalty of perjury that says that I'm subject to payroll withholding and that I owe income tax. That it's a declaration of that. So where is that in the law before you demand that I sign it? You can't work for me. Get out of my office. That's the answer you get.
Well, and we'll get to this part where we have to still live in a world where other people are of one mindset and you're on the other. Dave, what's your background? How did you get to the point where taxes became a major fascination in your life, and what did you do before that?
Great question. I was an independent business person, and one day I walked into the bank, and I walked up to the teller's window, and I knew the people at the bank pretty well, and the teller started crying, and she said, "Oh my God, Dave, I had to do it." So I asked her, "Do what?" "Well, I had to give $32,000 of money from your payroll account to the IRS based on a levy." And I was in shock because I had a CPA on retainer, and whenever something came, an envelope that said Internal Revenue Service, I gave it to my CPA, and I said, "Make sure that's addressed." And he'd fallen down on the job, and I didn't know anything about that. And it gave me a very bad feeling that I had lost $32,000, and this is when $32,000 actually meant something. This was more than 20 years ago. It gave me a very bad feeling that somebody had come and taken $32,000, and I didn't even consider it of my money because it was money owed to my workers. They'd already earned it, right? So they'd come and taken $32,000 out of my account that actually belonged to my employees, and I didn't know anything other than IRS. And that made me very uncomfortable that they could come and do that, and I was so ignorant. So I decided I can't do this anymore. I can't be ignorant. I don't want to get into this. This is nonsense. This should not be my area of expertise. I'm in the telecommunications industry. But I'm so uncomfortable, I'm going to have to. And that was the beginning of a 20-plus year journey. And at the 17-year mark, I published Income Tax Shattering the Myths, which takes those 17 years of research and distills them down to a very easily understandable, fascinating, and intriguing 408 pages so that nobody else has to do 17 years of research for themselves.
Interesting. Now, this fascination reminds me of how I became obsessed myself with investments and proper asset allocation as one way to make sure I de-risk my own portfolio and spread the net worth accordingly. You can go to wealthresearchgroup.com/portfolio to see how my own finances are geared up for this year and what I feel will happen this year. Can you help us on your end in detail understand the income tax and why it doesn't apply to most people that are actually paying it and have paid it their entire lives?
Absolutely. I'm going to cut to the chase, and a lot of people are going to be shocked by what they're about to hear. And on this,
I think they will be, and it's important for people to understand that Dave has studied this for how many years?
20 plus years now.
20 plus years, and okay, well, I'll let you to it.
Okay. Now, again, people are going to be shocked. I don't have the time on this show to give all of the information that underlies the conclusions I'm about to share with the audience, the factual conclusions, I might add. So it's all in Income Tax Shattering the Myths if they want to get the book. But here's the information. People believe that the income tax applies to everybody. It's sort of like, death and taxes, right? It doesn't. The question is, upon whom has Congress imposed the income tax? That's the question. Now, most people say, well, everybody. But that's not even remotely what the law says. When you get into the law, you find out that Congress has imposed tax on what the law calls 3 classes of persons. In common speech, we'll just call those groups, right? Okay, so 3 classes of persons. So who are those 3 classes of persons? 1, it is foreign, non-resident aliens with U.S. source income. Non-resident aliens with U.S. source income. That's the first one. The second class.
That's me. So I've been paying for a reason. That's good.
There you go. The second class, foreign corporations with U.S. source income. And the third class, U.S. citizens residing abroad with foreign earned income, which is an even more narrow category than it sounds. I normally don't get into that because it involves such a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of people. So the big message, the takeaway message here is that despite what people believe, having never read a word of tax law, what people believe is that the tax applies to everybody. What is in fact the reality is that the income tax has been imposed on non-resident aliens with U.S. source income and foreign corporations with U.S. source income. Now, having said that, I need to say certain Americans, we'll call them U.S. persons because that's what the law calls them, can be made liable for the tax of the foreign guy on his U.S. source income. But again, that's a very small category, and that's people who put themselves voluntarily in that position. And how that works, and I'll be very brief, a foreigner owns U.S. source income. It's time to pay that U.S. source income out to the foreign person. But there's a U.S. person as an intermediary as the money's flowing to its foreign owner. So the money goes to the intermediary, who's a U.S. person. The layman's way I like to characterize this is that U.S. tax law requires the last domestic guy with it to cleave off the income tax that's owed by the foreign person upon whom the tax has been imposed, and then forward the balance of his profits onto him offshore out of the United States. Now, when that U.S. person cleaves that income tax off, that now, according to tax law under 7501 of the code, is held in trust for the United States government, and that last domestic party with it, excuse me, who just cleaved off the income tax, now is absolutely 100% required to file an income tax and pay that income tax over to the United States government. That's how the entire system works, and I'm here to tell you by the IRS's own internal documents. It's all laid out in the book. All the documents are shown. The IRS's own internal documents, the Form 1040, 1041, 1042, 1043, they are all to be filed either by the non-resident alien or by someone who has taken the tax from the non-resident alien and is now obliged to pay it over. I'm sure people here in America who are listening to your show who file 1040s are thinking, this cannot possibly be true. How at 1040, no, I'm an American citizen. Right. And that form is not for you, never has been. And all of the IRS's words, not mine, all the validation is in the book.
So that's very interesting. As a non-resident with many business ventures in the U.S., it's been a real art to understand the tax laws as they apply to me. It looks like it's not even scratching the surface. As I told you off the air, we've discussed the possibility of a market crash, of how to prepare for it, how to anticipate it, how to thrive in its aftermath at wealthresearchgroup.com/crash. And one of the reasons being the national debt and the fact that there are currently about 200 million taxpayers, correct me if I'm wrong, but entitlements now reach half of the people in the United States. 50% of Americans receive some form of federal aid. Why do many people then choose to pay taxes in the U.S. currently? I mean, the way that you're describing things, taxes are totally voluntary.
I wouldn't phrase it as voluntary. I would say for probably 97% of the American public, Congress has never imposed a tax on them. Now, if you go to Title 31, Money and Banking, of the United States Code, and you go to Section 321, subsection D, it says the Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury is empowered to receive gifts in the form of income tax, estate tax, and so forth. So, right. So when an American citizen who has absolutely no obligation to pay the tax fills out a 1040 and submits it to the government and pays his check, it's received under this provision where the Secretary of the Treasury can receive a gift, and it specifically mentions a gift in the form of income tax, estate tax, and so forth. It's absolutely insane that any American does this. Now, if somebody wants to voluntarily cut a check to the government under 321D, hey, we're a free country, right? Do what you want. But the idea that people have to fear, if I don't fill this out, if I don't pay this money, oh my God, I'm going to go to jail. They're going to take my house. They're going to take everything I own. The fear, the part that kills me about it is it's completely unnecessary. Americans do this for three reasons. Number one, they're socialized from birth to believe the big lie, what I call the largest financial crime in the history of the world. Then, secondly, when they hear somebody like me talk, the gut reaction is fear. And then the fear blocks them from getting the knowledge, so they remain in fear. The really cool thing is for people who want to go out and get the knowledge, which I believe the best source to do that, the most comprehensive source that will leave no question in anybody's mind is Income Tax Shattering the Myths. When they get that, the turnaround is dramatic. It's a 180-degree turnaround. Suddenly they're like, oh my God, I can't believe that everybody else bought this. The lie, not the book. So it really is cool from my perspective as the person who's trying to get this truth out there, that when people read the book, when they're done, the government's false narrative is done. It's finished. No one who's read the book can ever be cajoled into believing this scam ever again, which is fabulous.
Very interesting. There are many people that choose not to pay taxes in America. Do you have numbers on the amount of people that basically opt out of the tax system?
Well, there are literally millions of people who don't file, who the government would say they should. The question is, what percentage of that know the truth versus what percentage of that think they owe the tax and think they're getting away with something? I'm going to guess that people who actually, out of 320 million people in America, I'm going to guess the people who actually know the truth that I'm talking about to some degree or other, maybe not completely, but they know there's something wrong. It probably measured a couple million people. And we need, what it needs to be about 50 or 60 million, because if we can get about roughly a third of the nation, 25% of the nation, to actually understand and believe and get it in their heart of hearts, down in their gut. I've seen the law. I know what it says. There's no question in my mind. This income tax thing has been a scam all along, and the American people, very, very few, the vast majority, have never owed a penny of income tax in their life under the law. Once we get about 25 to 30% of the people understanding that, it will collapse under its own weight. But because of that socialization and fear that leads to so many people refusing to get knowledgeable, we have thus far faced an uphill battle. But we are moving forward.
Well, many people will see this struggle like fighting cancer. No one does that and gets away unarmed. What are the current ramifications of not paying and being audited?
Well, here's the great thing. When you understand what the law really says, for instance, you're probably familiar with filling out, a W-9 in business. Okay. Americans in business all the time. One guy's providing a product or service to another guy here domestically in America, and the guy who's paying for it says, I need you to fill out this W-9 so I can report the payments I made to you. Okay. Here's the thing. Remember we talked a little bit ago about the U.S. source income flows to an intermediary and then it goes offshore to the foreign owner? Well, the W-9, when you look at it in law, it's only for the intermediary. Americans doing business amongst themselves should never fill out a W-9. There's absolutely nothing in the law that permits that. It's more of the ignorance, like the W-4. When you say, hey, can you show me the law before I sign this that mandates that I do this or even suggests that I do this? And the answer is, what are you talking about? Because there is no law. There's laws that are inapplicable and are misapplied, but real actual law that you can show somebody and say, here's the one that shows you should do this, that doesn't exist. Same thing with the W-9 being used between business people here in America. It's absurd. There's no law. But again, we go back to this, well, it's always been done this way. Yeah, well, that's illegal. So the point being, when you understand the truth, people who've read, for instance, Income Tax Shattering the Myths, they don't do that anymore. So they don't sign the W-9s anymore, and they don't sign the W-4s anymore. And what that results in is that you will never, ever hear from the IRS again, because you are no longer playing on their playing field. You are not signing U.S. tax forms under penalty of perjury that declare you to be a class of person that has been made liable or upon whom the tax has been imposed. You're no longer doing that. So what happens is, right, when you sign a W-4 at the end of the year, you get a W-2, correct? When you sign a W-9, at the end of the year, the person who paid you sends off a 1099. Those are pieces of evidence that you signed the form declaring that you are a person liable. When you stop doing that, the IRS doesn't get these presumptive pieces of evidence and they don't contact you anymore. It's absolutely amazing. People I'm sure listening to me right now are thinking, well, no, man. It can't be that easy. It is 100% just that easy. Once you've seen the law with your own eyes, there's no question. You're out. You're done. And you don't hear from the IRS. So people who've read the book understand there's no more. That's why I always say there's no more fear when you get it. The fear is gone because you know what the law says.
Is there any case in recent history, last 10, 20 years, where private citizen went to the government with this case and said, look, I'm not going to pay taxes because the law says so, and prove me wrong?
Plenty. I think the case that I think is the best is Vernice Kugelin. She was a airline pilot for, I think it was UPS. No, FedEx pilot, excuse me. She was a FedEx pilot. And she asked the government time and time again to show her where the law was that required her to pay the income tax on the money she was making. And the government refused to answer her. They would send her these non-specific generic letters that would say, Americans are required to pay income tax per the 16th Amendment, blah, blah, but they would never actually show her where the law was. Well, because she worked for a gigantic company and she had signed a W-4, eventually the government took her to trial. And the jury acquitted her based on the fact that the government, this is when they pulled the jury after the trial was over. When they pulled the jury said, we didn't convict her because she tried time and time again to get the government to tell her what law required her to do this, and the government declined. Now, here's the kicker about this. The government declined because of exactly what I've been sharing with you. When you said, just like I said to the employer, can you show me the law that requires me to sign a W-4? And they can't. It's the same thing with the government. When you have the facts and you say to them, well, wait a second, here's what the law says. Now, Vernie didn't go quite this far because income tax shattering the myths didn't apply. Oh, I'm sorry, hadn't been published yet back then. But when you say to them, well, here's what the law actually says. So why are you telling me something else? Suddenly they fall silent. I once was in a meeting with some IRS attorneys. And they were stunned at the simplicity. For instance, they said to me, what's this non-taxpayer you speak of? And I said, okay, first of all, I didn't speak of it. It comes from the federal courts. They coined the phrase non-taxpayer, not me. Secondly, I said, it's very, very simple. You go to section 7701A14 of the tax code that defines taxpayer, any person made liable for any tax within this title. Okay. So all you do is insert the word not. Any person not made liable for any tax within this title, and you have a non-taxpayer. And Lior, you should have seen the look on the IRS attorney's face. She almost fell out of her chair at the simplicity. And that's really the amazing thing when people read Income Tax Shattering the Myths is they are shocked at how absolutely simple the government scam really is. Because tax law seems like, the proverbial elephant with, 3 or 4 guys touching the elephant. They're blind men and they can't really tell that it's an elephant. One thinks they're holding onto a hose. The other one thinks it's a tree stump is touching the leg of the elephant. And that's how tax law seems to people. But when you take the 17 years of research that extracts the critical parts, the parts that really make the difference, not all of the falderah that surrounds that, you take those critical elements, who actually has been made liable, and where does it say that? And you extract those parts and you show people, they go, oh my God, unbelievable. It's that simple? And that's the reaction to, I think, everybody that's ever read Income Tax Shattering the Myths.
Well, with Wealth Research Group, the main message I project is that investing is a profession. Yet people dive into it right away because no one gives them a test to see how educated they are. But if you were opening a restaurant and risking money with it, you'd have background checks on all your employees and obviously make sure that you're dealing with professional people. And when you go into investing, it's almost as people think it's an adventure. So our newsletter is based on educating, and that's what I'm passionate about. That for you as an author, it looks to be a commonality with what we're doing. It's the whole point behind wealthresearchgroup.com/top, where I aggregated like 18 years worth of research into one full area of downloads. If you can take your 20 years of research and capsulate it into a main message to listeners right now, what would it be?
Don't live in fear because you don't want to get the knowledge. You're hurting yourself, you're hurting your spouse, you're hurting your kids, you're hurting the future of America. Be better than your fear. Get educated, stand up with the rest of us, and let's make a difference. And by the way, Lior, what you've done with your audience and the education is absolutely phenomenal, and I want to commend you for that.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you, how does the Federal Reserve link itself into this equation of income tax? Because we know that the the Constitution or the amendment about income taxes changed right after the Federal Reserve was created.
Sure, yes, the 16th Amendment and the Federal Reserve Act were both passed in 1913, and there's a reason for that. If we go back to Ronald Reagan's era, he impaneled something called the Grace Commission, and he asked them 10 questions. One of them was, where does taxpayer money go from the income tax? And the Grace Commission's...
That's the president asking them what's going on?
Yes, the President Reagan impaneled the Grace Commission and said, the American people want to know where their income tax dollars go. And the Grace Commission's response was that 100% of the income tax goes to pay the interest on the national debt, which of course involves the Federal Reserve System. And yes, that was in the 80s, and it's still true. And that's why they were passed together, because when you have a fiat currency system and you have a system which basically you can run the printing press when you want money, you've got to have a way to bring a certain amount of, this is a little bit complex to get into in the short time we have, to bring some, I'm going to call it for the sake of this discussion, real money back into the system. And that's what the income tax does. This fiat currency goes out into the community where it is given value by the fact that we exchange it. Because remember, when money comes out of the mint, it's just paper and ink, right? It's worthless other than the value of the paper and the ink. What gives it value is when we put it out into society and people actually then exchange it as a medium. And correct. So once it's given value by us, then the government takes a percentage of it back and feeds it back into the banking system after it has value. And that's a very short version of what the Federal Reserve and the income, how they're linked and why they passed in the same year.
Dave, let me ask you this, a follow-up question then, and this is just out of curiosity. What does the Fed do with the interest payments? You said that the Federal Reserve is getting the interest payments back from. I'm sorry. You said that that the federal government is paying with your taxes the interest payments on the national debt. Now, the interest payments are paid to whom? Who does the U.S. government owe money to? It owes it to foreign entities. It owes it to its own citizens, to every person or institution that owns the bonds. Now, the Federal Reserve itself owns a huge bond portfolio of treasuries. Do they have to pay the Federal Reserve itself, which created the money in the first place? Do they have to pay them interest payments?
Of course. Well, when there's a bond, the interest payments must be made. There's no way around that in law that I've ever seen.
And what does the Federal Reserve Bank do with the money that it receives back? What does it do with the earnings?
In law, it accrues to the interest of the United States Treasury. However, there are these parties throughout the world that are under contract with the Treasury Department to sell debt. And there's people that are contracted to sell debt to corporations. There's people that are contracted to sell debt to sovereign nations. And they make gigantic commissions on selling U.S. debt. Everybody thinks it's just done by the Treasury, and it's not. There's an entire network of financial firms out there that sell U.S. debt. And yeah, and absolutely. And they're agents of the United States Treasury, but there are people like, the giant financial institutions we know of and so forth all over the world. Some of them we've heard of, some of them we haven't. Yes, and they get paid these gigantic commissions. So while I probably right here, right now, can't connect them one-to-one, I would say that a lot of that interest that goes back to, say, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and then it is supposed to accrue to the interest of the Treasury Department, actually gets spent on these massive commissions to these financial enterprises.
Very interesting. Just kind of wrapping everything up, could you talk about where can people study more about this subject? You mentioned that you've written a book. Could you tell people how to check it out?
Absolutely. There's somebody can get on the internet and do a gang of research and spend hundreds or thousands of hours. They can go to the law library, like I did for decades, and they can read all the statutes and look at everything for themselves. And I encourage people to do all their own research. However, not a lot of Americans or people generally have that kind of time. So as an alternative, I suggest that people get my book, Income Tax: Shattering the Myths. And that distills all of those decades of research down to 408 pages. It is super easy to understand, I promise you. It was written so that an average high school kid could understand it. I don't know if I quite hit the mark, but we're pretty close.
It's actually a great gift to give to high schoolers, if you're a parent. What's the website for this?
I'm sorry?
What's the website?
Okay. The website, go to davechampionsliberty.com. My name, davechampionsliberty.com. And you can click on book, and you can buy the book. That's a tab at the top of the page. Or right now I'm running a tremendous special. You can click on store rather than book. And I'm running a special. I've only run it once before in the 8 years that the book's been out. And I don't want to do it again. So you got store if you want the special, and you've got book if you just want to pick up the book.
Very interesting. Dave Champions, thank you very much for taking the time. We'll definitely have you for a part 2 of a more lengthy video interview where you can kind of walk us through more of what's going on, because what I've seen in many of your interviews in the past is that taxes even were basically only on land and on slaves. And since slaves are not around anymore, it's only on land, but it's definitely not on our actual citizens. So we'll definitely have you on again in the near future. And thank you very much for taking the time and being here today.
Thanks, Lior. It's been great.